And so much of behind-the-scenes work is going on into our Mission Sunday this year. In fact, so today we're starting a new series to lead us up to that day. It's called Homecoming. And when you think about homecoming from the perspective of our missionaries, we want the Memorial Road Church of Christ to be a second home for them. And so as we anticipate all these men and women who will be traveling from all over the world to come to here, we want to prepare this place to be a second home for those people. But when it comes to you and when it comes to me, I want us to think about a spiritual homecoming. Like, what would that look like? Like, if you move away from your hometown for a while and you go to college, you get a job, and let's say you're away for years, maybe decades, and then you come back to the place you grew up. Imagine the kinds of things that you think about. You walk into the grocery store that you remember as a kid. You drive down the neighborhood street. You see the place where you wrecked your bike. Maybe you drive by the hospital in which you were born. And as you encounter your hometown and see these people and maybe some familiar faces, you start to remember, oh yeah, this is where I'm from. Oh yeah, this is my story. You see, no matter what we do in life and where we go and the kinds of things that we achieve, everybody has a beginning. And sometimes when you go back to the beginning, it's really helpful to remember who you are. And so over the next few weeks, that's our theme, and we're going to go actually to one chapter in the Bible that's where Paul really gets into this spiritual origin story of Christians, and it's Ephesians chapter 2, and we're going to spend a few weeks there working through that particular chapter in the Bible. Homecoming. Let me shift gears for a minute, come back to the idea of homecoming. When you pick someone up from the airport, or when you're picked up from the airport, the first question that's usually asked is, how was your what? How was your flight? And what we mean when we ask that question primarily is, did your plane take off on time? That's what we mean when we say, how was your flight? And so if your flight took off on time, then we say that was a good flight. And if your flight was delayed, we say that was a bad flight. And if your flight was really delayed, like if you had to wait hours and hours and hours and hours, then that's just a betrayal. And how dare that happen? And this is the worst day of my life. Now, I want you just to pause for just a minute. Maybe you've had this experience before, but flight. Like you're actually in a piece of metal that's 30,000 feet in the air, and there's no cables supporting this piece of metal, and you're traveling 500 miles an hour, and you land and you didn't die. And someone asks you, how was your flight? And you think, oh, well, I watched a movie. Like we have lost something in this world. Like we've lost the wonder of flight. Especially if you fly a lot, you've probably totally lost it. And I've flown a lot in my life, but every once in a while, I'll look out the window and it'll just hit me again. Like, what is happening? Like, how am I up here? And my heart will start to race. Anybody, does that ever happen to you still? Anybody still kind of recapture the wonder of flight? Okay, think about it this way. So let's say that time travel was real and that you could go to the medieval times and get a knight in shining armor and transport him to the 21st century and take this guy to the airport. First of all, that'd be a big problem getting through security, but you get the guy a new outfit, and then he gets on a plane. Like, can you imagine his reaction? Like, he'd be freaking out. Like, this is a miracle. This is magic. Like, what is going on? We're flying. Like, we have totally lost the wonder of flight. Or think about it another way here. So when you're driving your car and you stick your hand out the window and like your hand just like does this, like that's basically the physics of flight. And so like when you tilt your hand up, it just kind of jerks back and goes way up, and you tilt your hand down and it goes down. That's how the wing works on an airplane. You probably learned this in like elementary school, but we all forget how lift works. That's how it works. That scientific principle is happening to a piece of metal weighing 175,000 pounds, and it's just suspended in air. Like, flight is amazing. In fact, like, just another thing to think about here, like, can you turn and look at your neighbor for just like 2 seconds? And do you notice coming out of your neighbor's back, you don't see wings? The reason you don't see wings is because human beings are land-dwelling creatures. Like, we weren't meant to fly. Now, for most of human history, we've tried to conquer flight. So the first documented case is 1,000 years ago. This guy, he climbs up on top of a mosque, and he has these 2 wooden panels, and he has convinced himself that he has figured out how to fly. And he's told his family below, "Don't worry, kids, I know how to fly." And they're like, "Yay, Daddy!" Climbs up to the top, and he jumps off the mosque, and he does not fly, he dies. And he sets this precedent for like dozens and dozens and dozens of people throughout history have tried the same thing. Many people have tried to conquer flight, many people have died, and now, like today, 12 million people are going to be up in planes in the sky flying, and no one cares. So all I'm saying is, like, when somebody asks, "How was your flight?" I'm going to tell you the proper answer to that question. Here's what you should say the next time someone asks you how your flight was. You should say this: "I have joined forces with some wings and some engines and a pilot to beat the most relentless force physically in the universe, which is gravity." That's what you should say to someone about flight. It's really easy to lose the wonder of flying. It's also really easy to lose the wonder of grace. Especially for Christians who have followed Jesus for a long time. We come to church every week, and we know we're saved by the blood of the Lamb. We sing songs about grace, but we forget the power. We go through the motions, and we say, "Yes, thank you, Lord, and now I'm going to go live my life." Ephesians 2 is a text in which Paul tries to use all of his rhetoric powers to remind Christians of the magnitude of grace. It's a homecoming text, in a sense. He's saying, this is who you are. Remember where you came from. Remember your story. A little bit of background about this letter to the Ephesians. So it's probably a circular letter, so it probably went to several different churches. In the first chapter of this letter, Paul addresses the audience as saints, or God's holy people. So these are faithful Christians. These are people dedicated to the way of Jesus. They're strong in their faith. He actually goes on in the first chapter to say that he's heard about these people from others, that they are strong in their faith, and that they have a depth to their love for God's people. So in other words, these are righteous, kind, loving, gracious, devout disciples of Jesus, the people getting this letter. And so in chapter 2, he writes these words. He says, "As for you," as in you faithful, holy, loving Christians, "you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the Spirit, who is now at work in those who are disobedient." So here Paul's saying, don't forget your story. You had a time in your life when you were caught up in a different way of life, the way of this world. So he uses this phrase, the ruler of the kingdom of the air, which is a reference for the devil or for Satan. And Paul is saying, you were caught up in that. You were living out Satan's story. Now, what exactly were they doing? Paul doesn't say, but I would caution us from thinking that this is some dark, demonic group of people locked away in a secretive room practicing witchcraft. Even the phrase ruler of the kingdom of the air means this is public and this is accepted. Following the powers of darkness is rarely something that, or it's sometimes something that happens in secretive places, but often the way the ruler of the kingdom of the air works is it's accepted by the masses. And more than likely, this is the kind of life that the Ephesians were caught up in. In fact, just to give you some more tangibility in what it might look like to follow the ruler of the kingdom of the air, I want to go to a different part of the Bible. So in the book of Acts, Paul has some really interesting encounters in the city of Ephesus. And so we learn a lot about the culture of the city of Ephesus from the book of Acts. And so Ephesus historically in the ancient world is this epicenter, it's this metropolis of culture. It's got all sorts of people from all sorts of nations that would come to Ephesus. It was a big trading route. There was temples all over the city. There was arts everywhere. It was really colorful. There's a lot of flair to this city. And the magnus opus of the city was the temple of Artemis. And so in Acts 17, we read this in verse 35. Fellow Ephesians, this is people who worship Artemis and who manufacture little images for Artemis. They're upset with Paul, and so they say this. Fellow Ephesians, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image which fell from heaven? So Artemis was the goddess of fertility and love. And with her came all sorts of cultic prostitution practices. And so all this to say, one of the ways that the Ephesians followed the way of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, Satan, is by adopting the accepted sexual norms of their day. We learn something else about the city. In verse 25, we read, "You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business." So they're making bank on the worship of Artemis. And they'll do anything for the sake of the dollar. And so in a sense, think about this. We just did this whole series on idols. Acts 17, they all kind of come together. So you've got the idol of sex. You've got the idol of money, supporting the idol of sex. And so then when those two idols are threatened, in verse 29, here's what they do. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. So they resort to violence. When the false god of sex and the false god of money are threatened, they resort to the false god of power. And so all three of these idols are coming together in this riot in Ephesus, and they're shouting and they're screaming and they're passionate. Verse 34, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So in a sense, again, back to our idolatry series, anytime your idol is threatened, like maybe you're sitting here the day that Brian preached about sports, or the day that I talked about the power of a nation, and you felt that, I don't like that. Anytime your idol is threatened, you get really defensive, and I get really defensive. And that's what the city is doing. They don't want to hear what Paul is saying, so they're screaming at him for 2 hours. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. All this to say, this is how the ruler of the kingdom of the air works. It's public, it's accepted, it's just the current of culture of the day. And as the original readers of the Ephesian letter are reading Paul's words, they were caught up in that. Maybe it was in the past, perhaps for some of them it's still in the present, but they have memories of, oh yeah, I remember when money was everything to me. Oh yeah, I remember when I was a violent person. Like they were caught up into all of this. And so back to Ephesians, Paul says this, verse 3 of chapter 2. All of us, so now he's putting himself in the list. This incredible Christian man, the leader of the early Christian movement. He says us, like I was caught up in this world too. All of us lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Paul is saying this is the story of all of us, even the best of us. We have become slaves. Slaves to the gods of self, of money, of sex, of violence. We have become so attached to these gods, just like the Ephesians were, that we don't even realize the power that they have over us. And then the turn comes in verse 4. Again, this is the homecoming story. Paul is saying this is who you are, this is who we are, this is our spiritual origin story. So we were dead in our transgressions, but verse 4 he says this, but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in our transgressions. It's really easy to lose the wonder of a flight. It's also easy to lose the wonder of grace. And this verse helps us recapture that wonder. So I want you to think about yourself in your sinful condition. Like the moment where you chose to rebel against God, either in the past or in the present. This could be an action that you think about, yeah, I remember that time I did this, or I said this, or this could be more of an attitude of rebellion, this just serving of the self. But the reality is all of us, just like our ancestors, Adam and Eve, we've had a moment where we betrayed the goodness of God and we went our own way. We've all bought the lie of Satan at one point or another. We've all corrupted our hearts and have begun to undo God's good creation. This is all of us. I want you to think for a moment about some of the metaphors we use to describe the Christian life. So the path is a big metaphor in the Bible. It's a good metaphor. We talk about on the road or hiking, those kinds of metaphors, pilgrimage. And they're good. That's a good metaphor, but the one weakness of that metaphor is that if you really carry out that metaphor to the extreme, you can almost say, if I just keep taking steps, I'll eventually get to the top of the mountain. Like I'll save myself. That's a weakness of the hiking metaphor, is you really can't save yourself. So maybe a more apt metaphor, sticking with flight, would be this. Let's say you're on a plane and you and all the passengers, because of something you did, I don't know what it would be, somehow you cause all the engines to go out. Maybe everybody's obsessed with their own devices and there's some short in the electrical system or something, and the engines, they go out. And now let's say there's no pilot in the plane. It's like you're just in a plane, the engines have gone out, and there's no pilot. This would be more accurate to describe the spiritual condition of our hearts. Paul says this is called death. He calls this dead. You were dead in your transgressions. But here's the power of the gospel, Paul says. When you were dead and the plane was going down and you had no hope, Paul says, God made you alive. He breathes new life into your soul. And why does he do this? Paul tells us it's because of his great love for us. His great love. See, God loves you just because. And it's not because of the things that you do. It's because of who God is. He just loves you. And so if we're going to take the plane metaphor a step further, we might say this. The plane's going down, the engines are out, there's no pilot, and a man in the plane stands up and he hands out parachutes to everybody and says, I want everybody to jump off the plane, and I'm going to go to the cockpit, and I'm going to fly this plane into the ground. And so everybody gets their parachute, including you, and you jump out of the plane, you pull the cord, and you're floating down, and you see the plane go down, and it hits the ground, and it blows up, and as the smoke billows into the sky, you would realize at that moment, I did not save myself. That's grace. And this precisely is what God has done for us, and we just lose sight of it. See, when Jesus goes to the cross, He's pulling onto himself all the dark tentacles of Satan's power. Every crime, every act of evil, every lie, every deceiving thought, every horrific abuse, from the blood of Abel crying out from the ground to the blood of the Holocaust, he invites it into himself, and then he plunges into his own willing and horrific death, so that he can destroy the power of death and set us free from those sins that lead us to death. Like Jesus does this for us because he loves us. And Paul's point is simply this: you didn't do that on your own. Like, see, the problem for me, and probably for a lot of us, is that back to the parachute metaphor, we've jumped out of the plane, we've pulled the cord, and because we can control the cords a little bit, like because we can pull this one, go right a little bit, and pull this one, go left a little bit, we get caught up in the illusion that we have somehow saved ourselves. The pilot went down with the plane. That's what saved us, not our own power. And all this brings this text up to Paul's climactic statement, one of the most famous verses in the entire Bible. It summarizes the whole gospel story in 2 verses. Paul says this: "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. This is not from yourselves, it's the gift of God. Not by works, so that no one can boast." Some of the most amazing people that I know are in this room. Some of you are incredibly smart, way smarter than me. You're well-read, you're insightful, but you need to know that your intellect cannot save you. Others of you are so gifted at making money, and you have had and currently have incredible careers. And you make money, and you're really generous with it. Like you give so much of it away to the church, to Mission Sunday, to nonprofits, to the poor. Like you're good at making money, you're good at giving your money away. You're just so diligent with your finances. But you need to know your money and your giftedness to make money can't save you. Others of you are incredibly kind. Like you have done things for me and you leave me speechless. You're so gracious and kind, but you need to know your kindness can't save you. You could devote the rest of your life to humanitarian work all around the world. That can't save you. You cannot be successful enough, or smart enough, or good enough, or strong enough, or pious enough, or sweet enough, or moral enough to save yourself. We all need grace. And just like flying, it's really easy to lose the wonder of that grace. I want to tell you a story from the mission field. I'll tell you about a guy who does understand the power of grace. This is a man named Sohail. He grew up in Iran, part of a really prominent family. He's really articulate, very persuasive, highly successful, had connections everywhere in Iran. And because of his personality and his wealth and his prominent family, he could do whatever he wanted, and he did. So earlier in his life, he got really heavy into the drug scene, into the alcohol scene, the party scene, to the women's scene. He lived for the weekends, lived for the moment. He eventually got to the point where every minute of every day was spent consumed with the idea of when's the next time I can get drunk, or when's the next time I can get high. He was full out addicted. His family tried to help him over and over, but it didn't work, and so eventually they disowned him. So he was out on his own. He got arrested at one point, spent some time in jail. When he was released from jail, the Iranian police said, if you get arrested again, you're going to be sentenced to death. And so he was out a few weeks after that, pretty low point, trying to figure his life out. It was the middle of the night. He went to a park. He was completely drunk. He saw a friend that he had known from years ago, is actually a former high-level criminal. Except his friend was different this night. His friend wasn't drunk. His friend was sober, full of peace, giving out hugs to people. And so Sohail was like, what is going on with you? And the friend said, I'd love to tell you about it. Let's wait till you're sober. And so the next day they met, and the friend said, I want to tell you about two things. I want to tell you about Alcoholics Anonymous, and I want to tell you about Jesus Christ. And that was a turning point for Sohail. And over the next few days, he started talking to this friend, and he realized that if he didn't leave his current life, he wasn't going to change, and so he actually moved. He moved to Vienna, found an AA group, and one day he happened to meet our missionary, Jake Haskew. And so they developed a friendship, and Jake started studying the Bible with Soheil, and then eventually Soheil gave his life to Jesus, was baptized, and he's now one of the most active members in the church. He gets grace. Like, he understands salvation. But one of the things I'd want to say to you this morning is that we need grace just as much as he does. So here, I want to leave you with one final question as we close this first lesson on this series. Going back to the flying metaphor, just a question to think about the rest of your day. Do you live like God is your pilot or your flight attendant? Because there's a really big difference here. Some of you live like God's your pilot, and you've given him your trust. You live under his authority. He is clearly your leader, and he's the one making the plane go, making your life go. Others of you might live like God is your flight attendant. And if you're one of those people, then you might think, well, yeah, God's the guy that makes my life comfortable. And he gives me a really good safety talk. And he gives me some good literature to read. And he gives me a snack. And he tells me to sit back and enjoy my life. God is not your flight attendant. And he is not just here to make your life comfortable. He saved you because he loved you. And your salvation is just as miraculous as the empty tomb. And so we're going to sing perhaps the most famous hymn of all time. And as we sing this song, I want you to really lean into the wonder of grace. You did not save yourself. As we sing this song, if there's anything this church can do for you, if you'd like to give your life to Jesus in baptism and be saved by his grace, I would love you to come tell me about that while we stand and while we sing.